Well, let's see if I have all of this straight. It's starting to get darker a little earlier in the evening. Some of the leaves are changing color already, and the kids are back at school. That can only mean one thing. It is hockey season once again. And when it's hockey season, that guy over there by the name of Dan Mahar joins me. I'm Mike Farwell on the OHL podcast. And if it's a new season for school and coming up on the season of fall, it must be a new season here on the OHL podcast. Dansky, did you get up to anything fun this summer? Tell us what you did on your summer vacation.
Nothing too exciting. Had a whole bunch of the kid stuff as usual. So some outdoor stuff, some baseball, some golf, but it felt like a 2-week summer, didn't it?
Somebody said to me not that long ago that the older you get, the faster it seems to go. And clearly that means that we are both getting older because you blink and you miss it. But, I was thinking back on it, and boy, oh boy, did we ever have some great opportunities this summer. Earlier on, it was a friend that loaned us their cottage called Sanctuary Wood. If you look it up on Instagram, you'll be really impressed. It's on Colpoys Bay, just outside of Wyerton. So we got to spend some time up there. We had another family loan us their place in Huntsville, which was incredible. Spend some time up in the Muskokas that way. Long weekend. Canada Day, went stateside to Buffalo, watched some baseball and some micro wrestling. If you've never done it, don't knock it. Do not knock it until you've tried it. And had a little motorcycle trip up through the north of Ontario, stopped by the North Bay Memorial Gardens, cut over into Quebec where the roads are rotten, by the way. I don't know how those buses do it in the queue, but that's a whole other story. And one of the other things that was really cool, anybody who knows me knows that I'm a Kitchener boy through and through, born and raised, love the region of Waterloo, which is the region where the city of Kitchener exists. And I had a chance to go to a place in Elmira. So if you see my golf shirt here, if you're watching on our YouTube channel, you can see Olympia on the sleeve of my golf shirt. If you're not watching on our YouTube channel, hey, Dan and I have a YouTube channel as well, so you can follow the OHL podcast on YouTube. But Olympia is the ice resurfacing machine made right in Elmira, not just the home of the Sugar Kings and the great Junior B hockey tradition there, but Elmira, another small town in the region of Waterloo in the township of Woolwich. And they make these ice resurfacing machines. I even have if you can see behind me here, again on YouTube, I've got a little die-cast model now of an Olympia ice resurfacing machine. They're made at a company called Resurf Ice Corp. And if you ever watched the thing that goes around resurfacing, flooding the ice between periods or before games, if you're anything like I was when I was a kid, there goes the Zamboni. There goes the Zamboni. Au contraire, Monaby. Au contraire. That is the ice resurfacing machine, but just always calling it a Zamboni is like calling every tissue Kleenex. It's a brand name on it. So watch for the ones that say Olympia on the front because they are Canadian made. And don't get on my case yet, Brantford. Come on. I know there is a Zamboni production facility there, but it's a US based company. Nothing against our US teams in the O, but I'm a local boy through and through. And they make the Olympia ice resurfacers in Elmira. Got to tour the facility, got to drive me an ice resurfacing machine. I don't know, Dan. Who had a better summer than me? You tell me that.
Well, yours was far more interesting. I mean, I did see the video of you driving the Olympia, and I think you're on par with Nate McKinnon for sure.
And
And I won't ask if you won your micro wrestling match. I don't know. I don't know how that
wow,
went.
you went there, eh? Listen, that's why I figured it was okay that I went because I wanted to be amongst those who are who I'm a little bit more alike. And I'm glad you noticed that Nate McKinnon also drove an Olympia in the all Canadian Tim Hortons commercial. So thought I'd share some of that stuff from the summer that was as we enter our third season here on the OHL podcast and the second full season for you and I together, Dan. Really happy to be now a part of THPN, which is the Hockey Podcast Network. Dozens and dozens of hockey podcasts across North America have welcomed us into the family. There was no hazing. There was no rookie initiation. Everybody's been more than welcoming, and nothing changes from your end as a listener. You're still going to find Dan and I in the same places. Dan on Twitter or X at Dan Mahar, his name. I'm at Farwell _OHL. And you can send us an email anytime, ohlpodcast@rogers.com. Since it's kind of like back to school time, I feel like maybe we should do roll call, Dan, take some attendance, because last year we were able to get touch points in all 20 OHL markets. So wherever you're listening from, shoot us an email, ohlpodcast@rogers.com. Drop a comment on the podcast page on YouTube, whatever it is, and let us know where you're listening from. We'll check in with all of our markets to make sure that you're ready for another season. And, as tough as it is watching the leaves change color and the weather get cooler, Dan, this is a fun time of year, isn't it?
Well, it's by far the one thing that keeps this time of year fun for me. I don't know about you, but I always find the September, October stretch stressful and all those things going on outside. But it's hockey that kind of keeps me going this time of year. So yeah, it is a fun time of year. A lot of catching up to do, Mike. Like I think I don't know about you, but my brain through the summer forgets a lot of what I knew in May. So I have to go through the annals and the blogs and records and figure out who's where once we hit September.
I'm with you. And there's been a lot of player movement over the summer, which we'll get into in just a moment. Coaching changes. We'll get into that in this episode as well. And you talk about stressful. Obviously, with the start of school, it can be stressful for families. And I have a brand new appreciation for every family that has ever sent their 15 or 16-year-old son out to play hockey in another city. I know I love the OHL. I think the Billet family program is underappreciated in the league and they get welcomed into these new homes. But we dropped our daughter in Ottawa this past weekend to become a GG. And it is the weirdest slash, dare I say, saddest thing to watch your kid just wander out of your eyesight in a brand new city. And then you turn around, get back in the car and go away. Absolute bittersweet. It's been way more bitter for us so far. So whole new appreciation. And if you haven't done it yet, remember this moment because it hits pretty damn hard too.
I can imagine, Mike. I just remember it from siblings and that when I was that age. But the one thing that I've told you, you can rest assured that that she's going to be doing quite well in just a matter of weeks, and that might be the hardest thing to know that your child is actually doing quite well without you. And maybe a 67s fan now that they're in Ottawa. But I digress.
Hey, listen, nothing wrong with the barber poles. We love our Eastern Conference. We love all the teams in this league because it is all about the games that are played, the players who compete in them, the greatest development league in the world here, the Ontario Hockey League. So we're really happy to be back, as mentioned, with the Hockey Podcast Network. We are now members of that for this year. And with that comes so many different opportunities, including our opportunity to welcome to this podcast as well, DraftKings. Remember, not only are we getting ready for another OHL season, which kicks off at the end of September, but NFL Week 1 is already here. That's right. We're talking the National Football League, and a new season means new ways to get in on the action at DraftKings Sportsbook, which is an official sports betting partner of the NFL. If you're ready to place your first bet, try betting on something simple like picking a player to score a touchdown. I'm a big Pittsburgh Steelers fan, so I'm watching my boy Najee Harris for the opener. He's a plus 160 to score a touchdown. Or how about George Pickens? Maybe Russell Wilson can get him the ball. We'll find out. Pickens is a plus 175 to put up a touchdown in week 1 action. And then you can do a touchdown dance of your own. Score big with DraftKings Sportsbook, the best place to bet touchdowns. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code THPN. That's code THPN for new customers to get $250 in bonus bets when you bet just $5, and you get 1 month of NFL Plus Premium on us, only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. The crown in the Ontario Hockey League this upcoming season, Dan. Dare I say it is the London Knights' crown to lose. I mean, they are the defending league champions. As we come into a new season, London looks like they will be strong. But when we look at some of the off-season moves, the Flint Firebirds, I mean, the roar had barely died down in neighboring Saginaw after that thrilling Memorial Cup win. Less than 2 weeks later, early June, and the Firebirds are pulling off a pretty significant move, acquiring Nolan Collins, Evan Conyon, Matthew Mania, and the rights to Josh Colosimo Forgive me, Josh, if I'm pronouncing your last name wrong. Colosimo, but played with Georgetown and the Brantford 99ers last year. Colosimo's younger brother, Christian, a fourth rounder with the Flint Firebirds. So maybe they think that the brotherly combo will work there. In return, though, the Firebirds sending Gavin Ewells, Dax Klinkhammer, and count them, 9 draft picks to the Sudbury Wolves. 2 seconds, 2 thirds, 2 fourths, a fifth, a seventh, and a ninth. What do you make of the Firebirds' early splash, Dan?
Well, it's a huge statement. For one, obviously, when you shift that many bodies, you're looking for some sort of change, and it wasn't just a straight. We're going to contend. We're going to bring in some vets like Mania and Collins and move out some younger players. They turn around. They trade Tristan Bertucci. They make a couple other additions from Niagara. There was a lot going on there. And when the dust settles in Flint, it's almost like half the dressing room just turned over. And it was almost like they were looking for a complete dynamic change in terms of maybe culture, maybe approach to the game. All I know is that the Firebird fans have to be. I would be excited if I had a GM that was doing that much to kind of shape the season. And we know that they want to make noise this year. They kind of wanted to last year, but it didn't work out. This year it's a whole makeover, but they brought in some serious names there, so we'll see how it goes. But you're going to need a program.
I remember talking about the draft picks that the Firebirds were acquiring through last season, going back to the offseason as well. And it was north of 20. So that puts you in position to be able to spend 9 of those picks on one deal with Sudbury. And you talk about that back end, Bertucci out, and we'll get to that more in a moment. But you're bringing in guys like Collins and Mania, and you're setting yourself up in a pretty good position. The one thing about this, and you talk about the culture change, when you're making a move like the Firebirds have made, and obviously the first team, I suspect there will be at least one more that decides they're going to challenge the London Knights. I mean, as much as it looks coming into the season like London will be the cream of the Western crop again, nobody just rolls over and dies for them. So Flint has already said, okay, we're going to challenge. I do wonder, though, the acquisitions experienced, yes, talented, yes, but those Wolves were expected to do more than they were able to accomplish last year, ultimately being swept in the second round. So not necessarily the pedigree, certainly in the playoffs, that you might want if you're thinking of making a run against London this year.
Yeah, you raised an interesting point there, Mike. When some teams look at the teams on paper and say, we're not going to be able to compete with that, and they make these calls at this time of year. And you're right. I mean, when you look on paper, assuming everyone returns to the London Knights that's supposed to return, you'd have to think that they're the favorite for the crown, and everyone's rolling their eyes and saying, "Oh, here we go again." When is London not one of the favorites for the crown? The difference this year is, at least in the West, there's probably fewer teams ready to challenge them. Whereas last year you had the Saginaw and Sioux, and this year I'm not sure there's anyone at that Saginaw Sioux level. So maybe Flint's feeling like that could be them. I don't know. Whereas on the other side of the ledger, you're looking in the East, and you talk about Sudbury and where they wanted to be last year. Fair bit of talent out the door. They brought in new coach. They've got a bunch going on in Sudbury, but you look at the East and you look at, the Oshawa Generals, you look at the Brampton Steelheads, you've got some powerhouses there. Brantford looking always to make a run. You've got a number of teams there that look like they're going to be stronger this year. So at least on paper at this time of year, Mike, it looks to me like there might be a slight shift of the balance towards the East. Hard to say, but I don't see much of a shift or loss of talent in London, unfortunately, for those fans in the West.
I'd throw the Barrie Colts into the mix there in that Eastern Conference as well. And if you're wondering, are the guys going to get deep into it yet? No, hang on. Our make us look like morons predictions for the season come a couple of weeks from now. As we're getting back into our weekly episodes, you'll hear from us every Tuesday, and the final 2 Tuesdays before the regular season begins at the end of September will be our Eastern and Western Conference previews / predictions. The Firebirds weren't done with that deal with Sudbury either. They bring in Christopher Thibodeau from the Kingston Frontenacs as well, and 7 picks go back out the door in 2 seconds. One of them, albeit conditional, 2 more thirds, 2 fifths, and a 15th rounder. But again, looking to add some experience and some pop. 21 goals for Thibodeau last year as the Firebirds make a deal with another Eastern Conference team.
Yeah, and another kind of interesting deal, right? Because I think you look at Thibodeau and watching him in Kingston, there were certainly flashes of high end skill there. A little bit of a firecracker in that lineup when he was on, and could make things happen. But then some prolonged periods of not a ton of production. So you kind of wonder where a player like that's going to be as they add a year of age, year of maturity. And clearly Flint's banking on this being a top of lineup guy based on what went out the door to acquire him. And you see it all the time. Players like that, you reference the 21 goals and you reference what he put up previously. Easily could see a player like that blossoming to, can he put up 35, 40 this year in Flint? That's an assessment obviously Flint has made, and based on the price they paid, I think that's what they're looking for out of Thibodeau this year.
Talking about that price, another way you could look at what the Firebirds have done, and I don't think either Dan or I believe that they're finished. I mean, there's still a trade deadline, and we'll see where the Firebirds are at by then. But you are looking at the additions of Collins, Kanyan, Mania, Thibodeau, as we've talked about. That's 157 points and 54 goals. Remember, two of them are defensemen, but still 157 points, 54 goals in exchange for 16 picks. Another way to look at what the Firebirds have done so far. Let's stay with Kingston for half a minute. Thibodeau to Flint. How about Gabriel Frasca down to the Erie Otters and grabbing a bunch of picks now are the Frontenacs, 6 coming back Kingston's way. So Kingston was one of those teams last year that had the year prior been in the running to host the Memorial Cup. Obviously, that ended up going Saginaw's way, and it went very well for the Saginaw Spirit. But when that happens, the Fronts you would expect to be a strong team on the ice didn't really pan out. And maybe this is Corey Cooper looking at the lay of the land there in Kingston saying, you know what, it's time for a bit of a rebuild. The Thibodeau and Frasca moves have brought in a boatload of draft picks.
Yeah, and I'm one of those ones last year, Mike, who thought might see a little more out of Kingston, especially with the moves they made at the trade deadline. They looked to me like they were loaded up for a playoff run. Things didn't work out. Another disappointment for Kingston, unfortunately. You wouldn't think necessarily moving in 06 like Frasca is what you're looking to do because he's got a couple years left. But Frasca had an injury-riddled year last year. They had trouble counting on him in the lineup because when you return from injuries, there's always a couple weeks where you're kind of not on top of your game. So nothing materialized for Frasca last year. And I think he may just be looking for a change of scenery here. Had indicated that he'd like a move. And then, of course, you have Erie and a number of teams probably looked at him and said, here's a guy that pretty high pedigree, lots of potential, was thought of as a high NHL pick prior to the injuries. So I think a lot of things going for this kid, and I think, some of these kids put it together at 18 and 19 in this league, and that's a pretty decent bet for the Erie Otters, if you ask me.
You and I spent considerable time last season on this podcast talking about the young players on the then Mississauga Steelheads. Work with us, okay? Because now they're the Brampton Steelheads. Same team nickname, slight change of location, not all that far apart. Anybody that knows Southern Ontario, Mississauga, Brampton, basically neighbors. But then Mississauga, we loved the young players on this team, right? The Misas, the Martones. It just goes on. The two-headed monster in net. And, coming into the playoffs, inexperienced, but we thought you never know what Mississauga may be able to pull off. Looked like a team that was blossoming maybe even a little bit early. Well, they seem to be of the mind coming into this season that they want to be the team in the Eastern Conference that others are chasing. And James Richmond goes out and swings a big deal for one of last year's biggest goal scorers in Carson Rakoff. 52 goals last year with the Kitchener Rangers, goes across the border, if you will, to the Eastern Conference for 10 draft picks going back to the Rangers, 3 seconds, 3 thirds, a fourth, and a fifth.
Well, we knew that the Brampton Steelheads were going to make a push this year. And we'll get into this in the upcoming pod where you talked about our predictions, where we're going to look foolish. But it's no secret we both think very highly where that team is headed this year, and they're loaded for bear, especially up front. And you look at the trades that James Richmond pulled off. So he had accumulated all these assets. Now's the time to use them. You bring in probably no better goal scorer in the league than Carson Rakoff. You load him up front with, you just named him, the Misas and Porter Martone and all these guys that are going to be top of league players, not just top of lineup players. And then you look at the wealth of talent they had in goal, which I'm sure you're going to mention briefly here. But Ryerson Leenders and Jack Ivankovic, both clear number one goalies, not enough ice in that crease. So he's dealing from a position of strength, recoups almost all the picks he gave up for Rakoff, and is right back in a position to do more. So what I'm getting at is I don't think James Richmond's done. I think before the trade deadline comes and goes this year, he's going to land a top of lineup defenseman as well, and that team's going to be loaded for the playoffs.
Yeah, you talk about recouping those picks he used, the 10 to get Rakoff. 8 of those picks come back in the Leenders deal that you mentioned. Here's what I'm curious about. You don't often see teams do deals even within the conference, much less it's not divisional, but so you're going outside the division. But the way I look at this, Leenders goes to Brantford. So let's talk about the Brantford Bulldogs, another team that you and I really enjoyed last season. A team we thought Matt Turek had a terrific trade deadline in terms of the return he got on some of his assets and the sort of sly little pieces that were added. And all of a sudden, you had a Brantford team that was making a whole lot of noise. First year in the Telephone City, fans were loving it. They were packing that barn. And we thought maybe they had matured a year or even 2 early, right? If you look at the Bulldogs, let's say, I was trying to think of how to say that because Hamilton, winners in 18, OHL champions 18, 22. So should be for 26. If you continue with the cycle, we're talking about 24, 25. Are they 2 years out? Could this be the year based on what we saw last year? And then you're Brampton and you're dealing a top flight starting goaltender to a team that could be competing with you for an Eastern Conference title. I kind of love it because it sets up a whole lot of intrigue, but maybe I'm misreading the tea leaves on Brantford. I don't know how you see that one.
Well, I love it, and I'll tell you why. From Brampton's standpoint, and yes, Brantford identified they needed an upgrade in goaltending. Here was an option. Let's get him before someone else does. I think if you're Brampton, you're James Richmond, you're looking at this and you're saying, on paper, we're better than anyone and we've got enough assets to stay better than anyone. We have to move one of these two. And it's kind of the philosophy that some of these GMs used. We heard Mike McKenzie reference it when he dealt Carson Rakoff. Said, you set your price, what you want to get for these players. And as soon as someone ponies up, you take it. And I think that's the attitude you have to have. And yeah, there's a little bit of hesitance to make any of your opponents, especially divisional ones, stronger. But at the end of the day, you're looking for a price. You're looking at putting those assets back in your bank. And if that team that steps up happens to be your neighbor, you go for it. And maybe who knows what happened behind closed doors? Maybe James Richmond said, Brantford, you guys are rivals. You might want to kick in an extra 4th-round pick if you want them because the price was this, but for you, it's this. I don't know, but I don't mind it at all from James Richmond's standpoint, from Brampton's standpoint, because you get your price, you do it. And you have to have confidence in what you're assembling, and it's going to beat whatever anyone else is assembling. So that mentality, I love it.
I think it's a lot of fun. I like the way that's shaping up. And it's interesting to me that when Brampton was in the league previously as the battalion before fleeing to North Bay, immediately following the departure from Brampton, the battalion organization goes to an OHL final. They win the Eastern Conference. The next year, they go back to the Eastern Conference in North Bay. Now, don't get me started. I know the fan support is not necessarily rabid in the Greater Toronto area. Okay. So I don't know how many scorned fans are in Brampton. Look, but maybe as the team now returns to Brampton, hey, if you're going to lay odds right now on an Eastern Conference champion, you could do worse than putting your money on the Steelheads. I almost said battalion.
Oh, absolutely. And here fans of the Brampton, Mississauga general area, I live an hour away and I'm planning to drive for a few of those games because they're going to be worth that. I mean, you're getting some supreme talent on the ice every night for a really good price there. And, you ask certain things of your team and you can't possibly ask more of your team than what James Richmond and the crew there has assembled. So they're putting the product on the ice. Let's go support them because you might not see a team quite this stacked for a number of years after. Let's go support it.
I think just the way that it happened after the battalion left for North Bay and the success that came immediately, I just think that adds another layer of intrigue to this season for Brampton, even before the season begins. And add to that intrigue what we already talked about, dealing with a conference rival and a team that could be competing with you for a top spot in the Brantford Bulldogs. So lots of interesting storylines already beginning to develop. We talked earlier about Tristan Bertucci, who the Flint Firebirds decided was expendable. Obviously, adding the likes of Collins and Mania helps in that regard. But Bertucci becomes a part of a good old fashioned three-way trade, Dan Mahar. And I love me a three-way trade. And of course, why wouldn't the Niagara Ice Dogs be involved in that three-way trade? Bertucci is in Niagara for a minute, ultimately ends up in Barrie. Flint ends up with those three young players that you talked about earlier in Artem Frolov, Urban Podrakar, and Hayden Reed. And then Niagara gets Jack Brody, who I think is a really nice piece from Barrie, and Kitchener native, former Greyhound and Ranger Blair Scott, plus some picks. But how do you see that three-way deal sort of settling once we clear the dust?
Well, we know how assets burn a hole in the pocket of the GMs in Niagara, so they couldn't hang on to Bertucci any longer. He'd been there nearly a day. No, but serious note, I'll tell you what I like most about this trade, and I like it from Barry's standpoint. To be honest, yes, they moved out some decent young talent, but when you look at their summer, it was kind of a tidy summer without breaking the bank. They bring in so Tristan Bertucci's a heck of a player on the back end, and they bring in a veteran like Brad Gardner from Ottawa. So you've added two pieces and two components to your lineup that are high end vets without breaking the bank, so to speak, without having a huge amount of assets go out the door like we've seen in some of the other trades. So you referenced Barrie a few minutes ago, and I agree. They're quietly building something pretty nice there, and it's kind of under the radar. So when you look at that three-way trade you just discussed, yeah, a lot of moving parts and pieces. But I think when you look at everything once the dust settles, I'm really liking what it's done for Barrie.
I don't know if there's any other deal that really jumped off the page to you, Dan. I know Erie was involved in moving little pieces here and there. And for me, I like that there is activity at times other than post Christmas and the days slash hours before January the 10th. I like to see teams kind of stake out positions like this earlier.
Yeah, for me, it's always better to do it at the start of the year. You know, you're building a culture, you're building a dressing room, you're having those players learn your system earlier in the year and get comfortable and finding out what your line combinations are. To me, and the prices, I know it might not look this way when you look at the OHL website, but the prices generally are a little lower in the summer too. So for a lot of reasons, I like seeing this stuff happen now. But yeah, a lot of times in this time of year too, it's housekeeping. Like you saw Spencer Sova move from Erie because of the glut of overagers there. They had to move him. It's not a player they necessarily wanted to move. And you see some of those kind of tinkering moves that are I would categorize them as housekeeping. You know, they fall under that. Let's figure out our lineup here and find new destinations for these players. And to be fair to some of these kids too, moving them before the school year starts, getting them set up in the new home and that not disrupting them mid-semester makes a lot of sense for all involved. But yeah, I'm with you. I like when there's something to talk about this time of year too, rather than this ridiculous run at the trade deadline, which may or may not work out for you.
So if I can try to thicken the plot a little bit by picking up on something you said a moment ago about Barrie and quietly with the additions of Bertucci and Brad Gardner putting something together, Barrie is also connected to an interesting rumor that's floating around the OHL. And as we're starting a new season here, I just want to put myself on record as saying this. Uh, it is notoriously difficult, at least in my experience, to find really credible, reliable, like will not let you down sources in this league. There's a lot of chatter. And maybe I don't try hard enough. That could very well be it. So have at me if you want to tell me I'm not doing my job well enough. OHL podcast at Rogers.com. But there is a rumor that's got a lot of traction over the summer months, and it is only accelerated by his absence from Owen Sound's training camp this year. I'm talking about Colby Barlow, who has decided that he's going to train himself and then head over to Winnipeg's camp and sort of skip the OHL step, if you will. Barlow's name is attached to rumors of a possible deal to either the Barrie Colts or the Oshawa Generals. Meantime, before you read too much into that, recognize that Easton Cowan is also not reporting to the London Knights camp, skipping that step and doing what the Toronto Maple Leafs want him to do. How much do you read, Dan, into the absences of, listen, let's not pull any punches here. Barlow and Cowan are about as good as they get in this league right now.
So I guess I don't necessarily read a ton into it from an alarmist standpoint for those teams. I think there is something to be said for these. These players are going to depart anyway in a week or two for these NHL camps, and all their focus is going to be there for a little while anyway. So instead of bringing them in, disrupting the room, doing all these other things, and then having them leave and maybe come back, maybe it's mutually beneficial to just say to those high end players like Barlow and Cowan, you focus on what you got to do for your NHL career for now, and at the end of the day, if you get sent back, that will be final. You'll be here for the year. That's focused then on implementing you into the lineup. And for a lot of coaches at this time of year, that's better anyway, because they want to see the kids. They want to see who's filling out the lineup. They know what they're getting out of Easton Cowan and Colby Barlow. So I don't see a big issue there. The only thing that would concern me a tiny bit, and this applies more to Colby Barlow, is that he sees a rebuild there in Owen Sound. Things didn't go very well last year. Is there a hint of, I'm not sure I really want to be in this town anymore, in this league? And if I do come back, would you move me? Is the heart not there? And I'm, of course, totally speculating. He's never said this. I have nothing to go on other than hunch and instinct. But I could definitely see some credibility to the rumors of Colby Barlow. If he's returned to the OHL, it would be a move to, you mentioned Barrie and Oshawa, two very viable destinations, obviously, for his services. I can see that happening. I think it's a different scenario with Easton Cowan, though. I think he's a 50-50 bet to break camp with the Leafs, at least for the first 10 games. And when he's back, he's back. He's all in with London. He's going nowhere. But so I don't read a ton into these guys saying at this time of year, I want to focus on the NHL piece, my training, trying to do what I can do at the NHL camp. We'll know in a month, and that's probably better for everyone.
Rather than throw more kerosene onto the fire of rumors at this point in the season, which hasn't even begun, we're just in the preseason. I'll take this in a slightly different direction and leave. I think your comments are very well taken, Dan. But what this reminds me of, and I take this opportunity to remind fans of as well, is that in this league, the players aren't necessarily your players, if I can put it that way. So they may play for the Owen Sound Attack or the London Knights or the Flint Firebirds or the Ottawa 67s. But once they get drafted into the National Hockey League, that dynamic changes and changes quite a bit. It's almost like the National Hockey League is the parent and the Ontario Hockey League / Canadian Hockey League is the kid. And once the parent assumes some control and or responsibility for that player, then it's largely dependent on what the parent wants to do. And so if the parent, the National Hockey League team that has drafted the player that wears your favorite team's uniform, decides that their best interests would see the player train with an NHL affiliated trainer or skip the junior camp and do this, that, or the other thing, then that's what's going to happen. And you touched on it too, Dan, when you talked about, Cowan breaking camp with the Toronto Maple Leafs and maybe even spending those first 10 games, which of course is the number he can spend before an entry-level contract kicks in, blah, blah, blah. We all are familiar with that through our time in the Ontario Hockey League. But you end up almost paying a price, if you will. There's a cost to you as an OHL team for having players that are too good, if I can say it that way, because you start the season without them because they're still at NHL camps. You miss time with them over the Christmas break because they're away competing for Team Canada at the World Juniors. It is not too long ago in this league that I knew a general manager whose philosophy, and we can look at this in hindsight or even talk about it if that were the philosophy present day, but he had been burned not once but twice by players who went to the National Hockey League after just 2 years of service in the OHL, right? The 18-year-old that the NHL team says, we want him now, and that's it. Remember, when you're drafting players into this league, the Ontario Hockey League, you're usually looking at a 4-year, 5-year cycle for your organization and where that player fits into that cycle. And if they get taken away from you, 2 years into their time with your team, that throws your entire plan out of whack. So this GM's philosophy became, after losing those 2 players at the age of 18, Mike, I'm looking for players that are going to be here 4 years. 3 minimum, but 4 or 5-year players. That's how he decided. So it's almost like, yeah, we really like this player the best in the draft, but he might be a 2-year player. We need a 4-year player, so we're going to go with option B instead. It happened. It was a thing. Some might still look at it that way, but I think we have to remember, and that's what the Barlow and Cowan cases make me think, National Hockey League's kind of making the rules here.
To some degree, yes. And it also depends which NHL team drafts your player. It's a bit of luck of the draw. There are some teams that don't believe in having teenagers leave junior early, and that's my preference as well. I think there's a very, very select few players that are ready to play in the NHL as a teenager. So I think the vast majority of them belong in juniors, certainly as 18-year-olds, if not 19-year-olds. So it's a bit of luck of the draw. I don't love that mentality you just described. Yes, it's a massive blow when you have a core player or maybe your best player ripped out of your lineup in a year where you're expecting to go for it. However, it seems like a little bit of a loser's mentality to me, because you always want the best players when you're drafting. And if you're doing your job too well and graduating these players as teenagers to the NHL, more players are going to want to play for your organization. You're going to have a better, you're obviously doing a good job at helping them progress through their careers as 16, 17-year-olds. That's a good dynamic to have. So I think the only thing you really want to avoid is you want to avoid being a train wreck type of organization in junior, where NHL teams are looking at you and saying, yeah, we think this kid really belongs in junior, but we can't send him back there. So we're going to hang on to him or do something else with him for the short term, because we can't have him playing in that situation. And I've seen that happen a couple times too, where an NHL team wasn't keen on sending him back to a certain environment. So then you get maybe some tinkering and dabbling and interference where the NHL team says, all right, well, we'll send him back, but only if you move him in the next week, or that kind of thing. So you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, the NHL team does exert some influence, but I'd be really hesitant to play that game of, I'm not drafting this kid because he might make the NHL at 19. That seems like you're shooting yourself in the foot.
I will say that was a philosophy from many, many years ago, not to date myself and how long I've been around this league, but it was many, many years ago when more 18-year-olds, it seemed to be a rash of them over a number of years, that were getting taken up to the National Hockey League. Your point as well, Dan, about a player's development, and it's never really hurting them to do that extra year in junior. My good friend in this league, Terry Doyle, who calls games for the Sarnia Sting, put it that way a few years back. And I love what he said. He's never seen a player whose development was harmed by doing another year in junior. Look at it the other way, and we have definitely seen players that went up to the pros sooner than they probably should have. Completely changes their career trajectory.
I couldn't agree more with Terry Doyle on that one. I'll argue that till the cows come home with anyone who, you get a lot of people who aren't involved with Canadian junior hockey that slam it and say, oh, they wish the NHL CHL transfer agreement was different so players could play in the AHL at 19. And they don't have this understanding, but I 100% agree with Terry Doyle on that. I've never seen any player stunted or hurt by coming back to junior at 19. I've never seen it. And I can rhyme off, just off the top of my head, on quite a few that have been stunted by being pulled up too soon. And there's some that had a lot of potential. I mean, just a name just popped in my head right now in Kitchener, Mikhail Bodker, who was pulled up to the NHL well too early. And a lot of people that were watching hockey in Kitchener said, this guy's a good player. He's got lots of potential, but he needs another year in junior to hone that offensive game, because that wasn't quite there yet. Gets pulled up to Arizona and didn't work out, hadn't quite rounded out that part of the game. And you cannot really develop your offensive game terribly well as a 19-year-old in men's league. So yeah, I'm very much with Terry Doyle there. I've never seen a kid hurt by playing as a teenager in junior.
Lots of players, as we have just documented, trading uniforms, wearing different sweaters for the season ahead. And we've got new faces around the Ontario Hockey League, off the ice, behind the bench, and in the league's front office. We still will get to those storylines as we continue this episode of the OHL podcast. This episode of the OHL podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. I don't know about you, but there are things that even as I get older, I still want to learn, but I don't always take the time to do it. Maybe it's a new language. Maybe it's how to repair a small engine. Maybe it's learning how to beat my buddy in a game of pool. One of those things, it seems to be one of the things, though, that we lose when it comes to childhood wonder. And the older that we get, the less likely we seem to be to pick up that thing and then learn it. Well, I'm here to let you know that therapy can actually be what helps reconnect you with that sense of wonder, because your back to school era of learning, if you will, can come at any age. Now, listen, I'm the first guy that will speak up and say, I have not only had therapy, gone to therapy sessions in the past, but benefited from them. And I think, frankly, my opinion, more guys have to be willing to talk about that and to talk about things, including what they might be feeling. I was actually having lunch just the other day with a buddy who said something similar, and talked about it as a life coach who helps him with coping skills, helps him set boundaries. These are things that we could all use a little bit of support in. It's not just for people, therapy, who have experienced a major trauma. So if you're thinking about starting therapy, why not give BetterHelp a try? It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient and is suited right to your schedule. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/THPN today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/THPN. All right, Dan, we've got 5 new coaches in the Ontario Hockey League this year. I guess not surprising, because one of the storylines we had last year was all the coaches getting fired. I remember getting a message from a coach in another league wondering what the heck is going on over there in the O with all the coaching changes. Ted Dent, 2 games into the season last year. See you later. 5 new coaches. We'll find them in Owen Sound, where Scott Ray takes over, in Windsor, where Greg Walters, already a familiar name in the league, is back behind the bench after serving his suspension. Steve O'Rourke gets elevated from assistant/associate to head in Oshawa. Corey Stillman back in the league with Guelph, late, of course, of Sudbury, and in the NHL with Arizona. And Scott Barney is in Sudbury now, taking over the Wolves team that we already talked about, maybe underperformed a bit this year. But thoughts on 5 new faces behind benches starting the
Well, there's
season?
2 that kind of intrigue me the most there, Mike, on that list. So O'Rourke and Oshawa, for one, jumps out at me as hired from within. Obviously wanting to maintain that kind of culture, what they're building with Derek Laxdal's exit. Theoretically, that all works. It intrigues me that a new head coach stepping up from the assistant role in a year when they're supposed to be really good. There's going to be a lot of pressure on him as a first year coach there, and so we'll see how that goes. But I think he's set up for it. Keeping that culture growing as it was being built under Laxdal. So that's an intriguing one to me. Just a lot of pressure on a first year elevated in that position. And the other one is Scott Barney. I think, all the time he put in helping that Humboldt team over the tragedy, 6 years out there, did great work in rebuilding that team and bringing them back from that. And now moves to Sudbury, which is a bitter rival of where he played in the OHL as a Peterborough Pete. So it'll be a really interesting move for him, but a great former OHL name to bring back into the fold in the heat of that rivalry. So those are the 2 names, I think, Mike, that jump out to me of the 5, but that's a lot of new names.
It's funny. Barney is one of 2 former Petes who are now head coaches in the OHL. One of them, again, in Corey Stillman, but Barney, as you mentioned, played for the Petes, and Stillman, now in Guelph, won a championship with the Petes back in '93. I'm with you on Scott Barney and what he was able to do in Humboldt. 6 years out there, and I don't need to remind you the tragedy that struck not just that community, but the Humboldt Broncos organization. And there was Scott Barney, kind of the glue, trying to hold it all together. And by all accounts, he did so, and he did so admirably. I've heard nothing but rave reviews about this guy, especially the way he teaches the game to young players. So I'm really interested to see what he's going to do with a young team in Sudbury this season. And you mentioned O'Rourke in Oshawa. And look, I don't want to put extra pressure on him or the players, the very talented players in Oshawa. Was Beckett Seneca not like one of the best stories of the NHL draft, when you could read his lips with his family pick third? He's like, what, me now at this point of the first round? Yes, you, Beckett Seneca. Lots of talent there on the ice, but I do wonder, and I'll reference this back to what we were talking about earlier with the Brantford Bulldogs and maybe to a degree the Mississauga Steelheads a season ago, who might have been a year ahead of schedule. How many times did we say that about the Oshawa Generals last year? And they went on, I won't even call it a second half. I'll call it a second two thirds surge, rolled into the playoffs on a heater. It was just really impressive. And we talked then how much of an impact a coach like Derek Laxdal had in all of that. Well, he's a 1-year wonder in Oshawa, and now Steve O'Rourke has got a lot of work ahead of him to make sure that a talented team that's expected to do well this year can do that. So I think your point is well taken there. Scott Ray in Owen Sound is an interesting one to me as well, because he's coming from a program that I think gets under recognized or underappreciated for its track record over the last, say, 2 cycles in the Ontario Hockey League. And that's the North Bay Battalion. 6 seasons up there as an assistant coach. And, you know, he's working with guys like Ryan Houlihan. He's working with guys like Adam Dennis. I think Scott Ray brings exactly what you need to the Bay Shore. So I'm interested in seeing that. Greg Walters, I think we know what he brings to the league, don't we? He's kind of got that calling card already from his time in Oshawa, his time in Owen Sound. He's going to bring a physical, defensive-minded presence to the teams that he's coaching. And I think it was the worst kept secret in hockey last season that Walters would end up in Windsor once that suspension was lifted, because he and Bill Bowler, the GM there with the Spitfires, are good friends. And Corey Stillman to me is the most intriguing. Again, the history in this league as a former coach with the Sudbury Wolves. He spent some time in the National League with the Coyotes, and now back with a Guelph team that, frankly, if you asked me today, I couldn't tell you. They're a bit of an enigma to me, and I haven't yet determined, and we'll get to those predictions, you know, before the season starts in later episodes. But what does a coach with the pedigree of Stillman mean to a team that, for me, hasn't yet established an identity? It'll be really interesting there in the Royal City.
That's a great point about Guelph, Mike, because they were a tough team for me to figure out last year. I saw a lot of talent on paper, and they had games where they were giving the top teams all they could handle, and then they'd have games where just kind of roll over. And so yeah, there were probably some identity issues there. I think this year they're probably going to have a little bit of a different identity when you have a player like Luchenko hopefully stepping into like a 1C type role and really taking a leadership role there as opposed to being one of the kids. So I think there's some things that Corey Stillman's going to have to sort out in his early stint in Guelph. But I think, yeah, building that identity is one of them. And yeah, with Greg Walters returning to Windsor, I think the fans there will like his rugged physical style. And I think part of it's just going to be, you know, how much can he get out of some of his new players like Keanu Reeves?
Very well played, and we will get to that
Sure.
in not too long a time. Speaking of pedigrees, though, and taking over, I don't know how I would feel if I was Brian Crawford, who is the new commissioner of the Ontario Hockey League, and only the second commissioner that this league has ever known. After 45 years of David Branch, it's now Brian Crawford's show in the O. And I feel as though, especially in more recent years, that I was a member of a decreasing group of David Branch fans. But listen, when Brian Kilray tells me in an interview that David Branch is one of the best things to ever happen to the Ontario Hockey League, when Don Cameron, the late great voice of the Kitchener Rangers, talked about how much he thought David Branch meant to the growth of the game and the stability of the Ontario Hockey League, that's pretty much all I need by way of recommendation to give my endorsement. Not that David Branch ever needed it, but there's no question in my mind that Brian Crawford is every bit following in the footsteps of a giant in this game.
That's an interesting take. Yeah, because I think early on, I've only heard good things about Brian Crawford. And I think until a commissioner really gets an opportunity to put his stamp on things, we're guessing. So it'll be that first time, you know, their ruling comes down or there's a change in philosophy from the corporate office. And I think we've talked about little tweaks we'd like to see about communication and how open they are with information and those types of things. So we'll see how he leans on those fronts. But I think for me, probably the biggest new challenge facing Brian Crawford that is was always something that was in Dave Branch's court, but maybe never more so than now, which is the competition the OHL is facing from the USHL and obviously the NCAA, the BCHL, different leagues. You have a lot of opportunities for these players, and kind of reestablishing the OHL at the forefront there as a really top option, regardless of what market you go to, is an incredible challenge for the new commissioner. But we'll see how he comes in on some of those things. But yeah, I'm looking for his first opportunity to kind of show us his cards.
So shameless self promotion here, but I had the opportunity just a few days ago to sit down with the new commissioner and have a conversation with him about a number of the things that Dan just mentioned and other things as he assumes the role of commissioner in the Ontario Hockey League. So you will not have to wait long. We will release that episode on Friday. The new commissioner, Brian Crawford, right here on the OHL podcast. So get ready for that. In his introductory news conference earlier this summer, Commissioner Crawford said his job now is listening, learning, and understanding. And he has committed, he's already unveiled his plan to visit every OHL community in the first several months on the job, which is one of the things that one of the criticisms I heard of David Branch last year. Why didn't he do a bit of a farewell tour, not necessarily to pat himself on the back, but why wasn't he in every market last year as he kind of exited the league that he helped to build over many decades in the role? I don't know. I'm not David Branch, but Commissioner Crawford has made it clear that he intends on visiting those cities. So you'll boo him when he hands out the trophy at the end of the season to the OHL champion. Maybe as he makes his first appearance in the arena in your city, you'll try not to boo him. I'll just leave it at that. Give a guy a warmer welcome. Come on. Come on.
Do we boo him, Mike? Because he comes from the golf world. I think it's a polite clap we give him.
Well,
Please.
then you give him any clap? I don't know. You hold up a sign that says quiet, please, or you suck. I don't know what we're going to do then. That's a very good point.
Well, it's Canadian Open. Maybe we tackle him. I don't know.
Hey, listen, he's got a background in the Canadian Football League as well. So you might be, I'd be careful, put it that way, if you're thinking of tackling the new commissioner of the Ontario Hockey League. And one other thing I would say is when there is a change like we're seeing in the Ontario Hockey League, one commissioner to the next, there might be an idea on the part of some fans that there's going to be dramatic changes happen. Like this new guy is going to come in and start putting his stamp all over things. I don't think you should expect to see anything too drastic in the entire first season, if not beyond. Not only is David Branch still kind of there as a consultant and support as Brian Crawford gets his feet or skates wet, if you will, for this season, but you got to remember that the Ontario Hockey League is a multi-million-dollar business. It's got so many moving parts. It's kind of like becoming the new CEO of a corporation where you're not just going to come in and start changing things dramatically just because you don't like the color of the curtains in the front office. That's just not the sort of thing that commissioners slash CEOs get themselves involved with. So any of the changes I think will be so behind the scenes that you'll hardly recognize them unless you're paying real close attention. But I wouldn't expect somebody to come in and start doing things dramatically differently than we've grown accustomed to. And I will let you in on, when it comes to doing things differently, is there room for expansion in this league? How much of a threat is the NCAA's allowance of players that played in the CHL to play there, to Dan's point earlier? These are some of the things we'll get into with Brian Crawford in that interview that's coming out on Friday.
Nice. Yeah. And just to touch on the one point you just made previously, I personally believe the strongest leaders don't make a ton of changes early. They kind of get the lay of the land. And unless you're coming into an awful crisis situation where you have to make quick changes, I think that's the way to go. And yeah, so don't necessarily expect huge landslide changes in the first few months.
Listening, learning, understanding, in the words of Brian Crawford, the new commissioner of the Ontario Hockey League. Okay, you got a laugh out of me a moment ago, Dan, with a very well-placed line about Greg Walter's new goaltender. But how cool was the Keanu Reeves Windsor Spitfires story? Many may remember Reeves as a Heaver in the movie Youngblood. He played goal. He was actually one of the actors in that movie, Young Blood, from back in the 1980s with hockey experience. Reeves was known as the Wall to his college hockey teammates when he played college hockey in Toronto, but he gets a one-day contract with the Windsor Spitfires. If the league can find a way to tap into marketing gold mines like this, please do it more often. It's so much fun to see.
Yeah, this is just an incredible PR opportunity, like you mentioned, right? Like that's a big name. Everyone loves the guy. What good attention, positive attention for the league. What a great play by the Windsor Spitfires. We'll see how long it lasts because I've seen the Matrix. I don't think he's actually that good at shot blocking. Uh, but if there's a bomb on their bus, like he's the guy you want there. So I think, yeah, but what a PR move.
It was a fantastic PR move, and it's a great way to elevate the league just a little bit. Before we go, I think we would be remiss, not that he played in this league, but the hockey world generally is mourning, and understandably so, the sudden and tragic and far too soon loss of Johnny Gaudreau. And let's not overlook his brother Matthew in all of this. In the prime of Gaudreau's career, and meeting their end, it's just the most tragic of circumstances. But what gets me is the man arrested and charged, allegedly an impaired driver. So I just want to, I mean, there's nothing I can offer that hasn't been said about Johnny Gaudreau, and it's not like I know the man personally at all. But I will just say that if you are a person, and I say this as somebody that has made no bones about the fact he enjoys his beer. I like a nice cold one. I really do. Most nights after I get home from a game, what do I do to unwind? I have a beer before bed. If you drink alcohol and then get behind the wheel of a car, like if you're going to these games that we love so much and we're talking about, and you're having more than two wobbly pops while you're there, and you're not getting the person you came to the game with to be the one to drive home, I'm sorry, but you are among the lowest forms of humanity. Drinking and driving is inexcusable. And I just wanted to deliver that message as we remember Johnny Gaudreau.
Well said, Mike. That's my takeaway too. It is not an accident. It's a choice you're making. And in 2024, it is disgusting and pathetic that people are still making those decisions. And you see the devastation on that family, those kids without a father, those that family, sister's wedding was the next day. It's just the layers of that story are just so horrible, all because that man made that choice. And to still have people in society doing it in this day and age, it's a loaded gun. And it's just unbelievable. So I couldn't agree with you more on that sentiment, Mike.
I know I told you coming into this season, Dan, that we were going to really aim for a 45-minute mark on our weekly chats. I think I spent too much time talking about my summer vacation, so I'm sorry about that. But it was a good summer vacation, and I got to drive an Olympia ice resurfacing machine. So there, you can always fast forward through those parts if you want. But I feel like we're in a good place to start a new season here. It's I'm ready to go already. Can we drop the puck?
Definitely, and good to be part of the Hockey Podcast Network as well. This is looking forward to it.
Yeah, they've really done a great job welcoming us into that fold. So we're looking forward to this next stage of our podcast evolution here. That guy over there is Dan Mahar. My name is Mike Farwell. Find Dan on X at Dan Mahar. I'm at Farwell_OHL. Send us an email anytime. Don't forget to check in. We want roll call. It's attendance for all 20 cities in the league, okay? OHL podcast at Rogers.com, or leave a comment on the YouTube page. And Dan and I will be back in your ears 1 week from now. Don't forget, Commissioner Brian Crawford will have that interview coming up on Friday. Dan and I back next Tuesday right here on the OHL podcast.